Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 46. I'm Nick Blevins. I'm your host. In today's episode, I talk with Jack Bauer, actually. We talk about that. And he talks about how he leads himself, how he helps himself grow as a leader. What does he do to lead himself? And then we also talk about how he has helped align his staff team. So Aaron is a former children's pastor that's now a NextGen pastor. And so we talk about the process that he's been going through just in the last couple of years of aligning his team from birth all the way through high school and becoming one team. Before we jump into the podcast, as always, I'd love for you to share a rating and a review on iTunes of the podcast. That would be really, really helpful. Or if you listen to it on Google Play or Stitcher or something like that, you can leave a review there as well. Always appreciate that. As usual, you can get show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 46. Everything we talk about, links, some action items, all of that can be found there as well. I mentioned in the last episode that I'll be at the Orange Conference this year in a few weeks. If you're going to be there, let me know. I'd love to connect. But that's all I have, so let's go ahead and jump into my interview with Aaron Bauer. Well, today I'm joined by Aaron Bauer. Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your church.
Sure. So I'm Aaron. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm at Journey Church, which is just kind of north of the downtown area. We've been around for about 11 years now. And I'm married to my wife, Whitney, and I've been married for almost 7 years. And I have two amazing kids, a 3-year-old, well, he'll be 3 in just a couple weeks, and his name is Graham. And then I have a daughter named Maisie who just turned 1. And so it's a fun time to be here and be involved with what's going on here. And I transitioned from a kids pastor into the NextGen role and been here pretty much since the day we started Journey.
That's
Church
awesome.
Just came in a few months after it got landed. So it's been really fun.
How old's the church now?
So we've been around 11 years.
11 years. That's funny. So is our church. We're like on the same, same path. That's funny.
Yeah. It's a great time.
I have to ask this before we jump in. Isn't your Twitter handle like Aaron Jack Bauer?
Okay. So everybody always asks me, they're always like, oh, you must love 24. Cause yes, it is Aaron Jack Bauer. And my middle name is Jack. Now I know that may be like a thing you're not supposed to do is like use your full name for everything, but I do. So in college, when I was in college, that's when 24 first started coming out and people knew my middle name was Jack. So people just started calling me Jack. And so some people call me Aaron, some people knew me as Jack. And so it's kind of like I just use both. So that no matter what sphere I came from, you get that it's me. And anyway, and that propelled into the show. But honestly, I've never actually watched the show 24.
That is
ever.
So funny. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
I had a feeling it was your actual name. Like it wasn't just a fun Twitter handle or whatever.
But what's great though is like when I meet somebody new, like that's how they remember me. Like they'll remember, oh yeah, his middle name's Jack. And so it just also is a great thing just to, when I'm meeting new people to be able to be memorable. I guess maybe that's weird and selfish, but I feel like it helps.
That's awesome. Because I've known you for a while, but I'd never had asked this before. I always just kind of assumed it was.
Yeah.
You remember, but part of me did wonder, like, was it just a fun Twitter handle or, like it's not really your name or whatever. That's hilarious.
It's not. Yeah. So really but some people still just running through the hall. They'll be like, oh, Jack Bauer. And I'm like, yep.
So now I need to say that I have Jack Bauer on the podcast.
You should definitely post that. Cool. You'd get a lot more listens that way.
President,
maybe.
Former CTU agent. That's awesome. Well, that's not what we're going to talk about, surprisingly, on the podcast today. We're going to talk about kind of two topics in one that both really are essential to you and your role. And one is leading yourself, self-leadership. And then we'll kind of switch gears and jump into alignment. Because like you mentioned, you went from leading children's ministry to leading the whole team. And I know a big question that comes up there is just alignment. How do you get alignment? But before we do that, we're going to talk about self-leadership. And for you, what does that mean? What does leading yourself mean to you?
Yeah, that's kind of a loaded question, right? So for me, self-leadership means that I don't know that I have a succinct kind of definition, but I think it means that I'm not necessarily waiting on someone else to like lead me. You know what I mean? Like, and that's something I can always be better at, but I'm not waiting for someone else to figure me out to be able to lead me. I need to know myself well enough that I know what I need, when I need it, and how I need it, so that I'm not waiting on some. It's kind of like when we're discipling people, right? We want people, we use the term self-feeders, but really we're wanting them to lead themselves to know Jesus. Now, we know that happens best in the context of the community. That's kind of how Jesus set it up. But at the same time, like, we want them to like have their own initiative that like says, hey, I want to go look in God's word. I want to minister to that person. That it's something that is just ingrained in them. And so the same is true with leadership. Like, you want to be able to become a better leader just on your own as you're going through life. It's just this impulse that's in you. And I don't think everybody has that. I think it's something that can be developed, but I don't know that anyone instinctively has that. They might.
Yeah, and you're right. There probably are plenty of folks who are listening who, without maybe even realizing it, actually depend on their boss to help them grow as a leader.
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That could totally happen. And not, again, probably not intentionally, but maybe just without thinking about it. And there are plenty of folks who want to be led and developed and, help improve by their boss. But at the same time, maybe that's just not happening for whatever reason. Maybe they're too busy. Maybe that's not how they're wired. So I think the leading yourself thing is big, because it's like you said, you really shouldn't have to depend on someone else.
Right.
To grow. Yeah.
And I think we can make that mistake of thinking it's someone else's job to do that. And in some ways it is, especially when it relates to the context of your organization or your church or whatever it is. Like, there's certain avenues, certain vision points that maybe need to be educated and taught. But when it comes to just leadership and what it means to lead a group of people or lead yourself, so, all right. So think about it this way. If you were employed by you, how would you lead that person?
Oh, that's good. That is a good way.
So,
because
we talk about people who are self-employed, but how do they actually lead themselves? So if you were to hire you, how would you lead yourself in that sense? Like, how would you lead you? Just like the way we think about leading other people, we want to know their strengths. We want to know their weaknesses. We want to know their problem spots. All right. Ask those same questions of yourself. And that's really what self-leadership is. So it really starts with knowing yourself, right?
Yeah. Unpack that a little bit. How does it start with knowing yourself?
Well, I mean, so usually people will, when they say they want to know themselves, are like, all right, so the most basic question, right? Let's go really basic here. The first question, introvert, extrovert. We've heard that question for decades, right? But we know there's so much more to a person than just those two things. Like, how do you actually respond? How do you actually react in different situations? Really, what is your default in a situation? So I know my default, and something that I was brought, I knew it of myself, but then having someone else kind of unveil it to me. I tend to be kind of reactionary. So when something happens that I wasn't expecting, like, I tend to react. So knowing that about myself, I have had to teach myself, and also knowing myself well enough to lead myself to put up other kind of blockers and barriers that will kind of let me, all right, take a minute, keep my mouth shut, breathe for a second, remove myself from the situation, and come back to it later, so that I'm responding rather than reacting. So you have to know yourself and know how you're going to react in different situations. And the great thing is, you probably already know that. Like, nobody has to unveil that to you. Nobody has to, like, surprise you. You're not going to be surprised with yourself. You know how you come across in certain situations. But then you also need to know like how you come across to other people. And you don't always know that, right? Like, I don't know how I come across to my, people that are employed by me, or to my volunteers, or to other families. I can guess, but unless I sit down and ask those questions, I'm not going to know. I can look at their faces and usually know, and they'll start saying things, or they'll all start pointing at the same thing. So, for example, someone told me a long time ago that when someone has an idea that they think is really good, or that I think I agree with them is a really good idea, what happens is I'll say, this is a phrase, and they started saying it around me. I was like, that's so true. I don't hate it. Okay, so that became like the benchmark. If you can get Aaron to say, I don't hate it, that means he really likes that idea.
Which is funny, because it doesn't sound like you really like the idea.
No, it doesn't at all. But it's like, but because I'm so reactionary, and because I'm so, like, that kind of became like like the joke, like if you can get Aaron to say, I don't hate it, that means he really likes it, because I haven't taken the time to step back, think about it, and really, really evaluate it. So that's my default, right? I don't hate it is my like, right. If I really like it, I don't hate it. So.
Which makes people it's hard to feel like they've had a good idea ever.
It's really tough.
Maybe you never say, that's great, or, oh yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I have to catch myself and follow up, because I still, even knowing that about myself, I'll still be like, oh, I don't hate that. And they'll be like, okay, so I have to come back and follow up. Yes, it is difficult. It's kind of like, so I'm a big Disney fan, and Disney is notorious when he was around. His team would always say that he would like raise his eyebrow if there was like something that somebody said that he didn't like or that crossed him the wrong way. Like his eyebrow would flare up. And so everyone has their little quirk. You got to know what your quirks are and know how that affects your team, and then lead yourself against that. So.
Especially since, like you're saying, they know it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They know it. So if you don't know it, it's not helping at all.
Right.
They're reading into you, even if you don't think they're reading into you, which is good. And this is kind of like leading yourself in the moment. You know what I mean? Versus, I think a lot of times, and we'll talk a little bit about this, but there's leading yourself to grow and, get better and all that stuff. But this is like in the moment leading yourself, which is good.
Well, that's tricky. It's a mental game, right? Like it's knowing yourself well enough that you can kind of put yourself on the other side of yourself. And we've heard this question before, what's it like to be on the other side of me? Like, that's a great question. And that's really what we're asking here. But to keep that in the forefront of your mind all the time, that is a challenge, right? To know how you're doing.
Definitely. It's probably even a bigger challenge to ask that question genuinely. What's it like to be on the other side of me? To the people you lead, because you don't know what you're going to get.
You're setting yourself up. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But okay. All right. So there's this thing that I heard about a long time ago, and I apologize to all the, psychologist people who I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it's called the Johari window. I don't know if you've heard of it. So if you imagine a window with 4 different panes on it, okay, there are things that you know about yourself that everybody else knows, right? So what I just described, like everybody knows that when I say I don't hate that, that's a good idea or whatever, right? So people know that about me, and I know that about myself. And then there's some things that I know about myself that other people don't know. And then there's things that other people know about me that I don't know. And then there's also things that nobody knows because I haven't experienced it yet, or I haven't gone through it yet. And it's just this unknown box of stuff. And I think for us as leaders, we kind of have to be aware of all of those boxes and kind of know, like, what is it that I don't know about myself, so that we can shift those things into that. Because if I know it about myself, if I'm aware of my problem spots, if I'm aware of how I come across, then I'm able to then do something with it, or fix it, or change my approach to that person. And that's really what self-leadership kind of is about as well. It's not just leading yourself, but leading yourself in a way that complements the people that you're leading. And so I think that's pretty critical to understand. It's not just about making yourself better. It's about making yourself better for the benefit of those that you're leading.
Yeah, that's true. Are there some ways specifically that you lead yourself more on the development growth side, less in the moment, responding kind of thing? Okay,
so this is something I think is important, and it's a simple question, is like, what are you reading, right? Like, that's a great question. There are people who call me up randomly and say, hey, what are you reading? And so I'm like, well, I got to tell you. And so I think that's important. Leading yourself really is educating yourself in some degree. It's reading different sources, taking the initiative to do that. And this is something that I guess I took for granted. But as I've led other people, I realized that, man, not everybody has that. Not everybody has that drive that's been developed to go seek out other information, to seek out things that they don't know. I think we're good at seeking out information about things we want to know the answer to, right? So, like, if I want to know, hey, how much staffing does this church have, or how much staffing should I have, or what does a person, how do they, decorate their kids' space for this theme for this month? Like, I can go find that stuff because it's a question that I have. What we're less inclined to do, I think, is go find answers to questions that we don't know we have, and that only comes by going beyond our box and saying, all right, let me just go read for the sake of learning something. Let me go learn something because I may not use it right now, but the more I put in my bucket, the more that's available to me when the time comes. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like my supply closet. Every church has a supply closet, right? Every kid's ministry has the supply closet.
Yeah, and some are clean, some are not.
Some are clean. We had cleaning closet day a couple weeks ago here, and it was great. But over time, like over 10 years, okay, that closet is massive. All right, it is a massive. It's an amazing. I'm probably bragging a little bit. I love my closet. I think it's great. It's well organized right now, but there's so much stuff that's in there. Right. But it's been built up over time. And so as we're prepping a month, I can be like, oh, I know we have that, and I can go pull it. Maybe I haven't touched it in 4 years, but I know that it's there. So the same thing is true when we're learning stuff, like when we're reading a book, when we're reading a blog, when we're listening to a podcast like this, when we're reading blogs, whatever it might be. Like we're putting that stuff in there and we're allowing that to kind of sit there for a while and it'll come back to us. And I believe that the Holy Spirit also, we know that about God's word, right? Like when we read it, God's Spirit will bring it back to us when we need it. And I think the same is true with other information as well. I think God will be like, hey, remember you read this a long time ago and it could really, supply you with something here. So just taking in information and not just, there's a second part to that. I think not just like church information, okay? Not just like statistics, not just like church decor, but also taking in information from beyond that. Like read a fiction book, because that will teach you something about the world that your kids are growing up in. Go watch a movie and then ask some questions. Don't just watch it blindly, but ask, right, why did this work? Why did the Lego movie work so well with kids and adults? Like that's a really important question. I mean, that thing made like almost $100 million in its opening weekend, right? Like that's crazy. So a movie that didn't have a franchise behind it except the fact that it was Legos. Like why did that work? So questions like that, don't just like take in information, but then ask yourself some questions and then file it away. I think that's important. I think the brain's good for that. I don't use Evernote. I know some people do, but whatever your filing system is, whether it's just in your brain, your heart, on paper, whatever it is, I think just having that is really critical and really key. So seeking answers to questions that you don't even know you have, I think we'll just kind of continue to propel that forward. So.
As you say that, I think about the fact that I usually find myself when I'm reading, it's usually books I picked out on purpose because I'm interested in what has. So it's not because some people are probably, I'm sure, read a lot more than I do, and they'll read all kinds of stuff and they'll come across more things they didn't even know they wanted or would help them. But even when I do pick a book based on the topic, more often than not, it has something in there that I wasn't even expecting, kind of like you're talking about, where I'm going to learn something that I wasn't even looking for, which is a good thing. Is reading books, is that like one of the big ways that you learn and grow regularly? And what else is part of your kind of routine? Like what does it look like in a week or in a month?
Yeah, so reading books is definitely one. I have a set goal every year of how many books I'm going to read. And people will be like, what's on your list? I don't know at the front end of the year. I know there are certain books that I want to hit, and they're comprised of fiction, nonfiction, church books, just general creative books, things like that. So I'm just trying to take in anything that I think would be helpful, and also some things that maybe I wouldn't normally pick up just for the sake. So something that's popular that I'm like groaning to read, but I'll read it because I want to know, why is everybody talking about this? What does it say about our culture and what we're doing? So that's one. Podcasts are another one. So this is an easy one that you can, listen to in the car or while you're at the gym, pretty much anywhere as you're working. So when I mentioned Closet Day a little while ago, we cleaned out a bunch of stuff. About once a month, I'll just go in there, put in my headphones and do a little quick organizing kind of stuff, just because I think it's good. I'm getting something done and I'm listening to something at the same time. So that's a good avenue as well. And then meeting up with other people in the area. So networking with people locally, I think, is really critical as well to developing yourself, because you're going to get ideas. I mean, think about your cultural context wherever you're at. So for us in Raleigh, man, our school system is so bizarre. Like it's not community-based schools. They're busing kids 30 minutes, 40 minutes in the morning. So it's very hard to integrate with a school because you might have 2 kids from one, 3 from another. It's crazy. So how do student ministries in this area really connect with students on campus? I want to know about that. So I'm going to meet up with other people and ask those kinds of questions. So just sitting down across from someone else who has that same role as you or is in that same kind of ministry and just saying, right, how are you getting it done? What are you doing? I can learn from that as well. I think that's pretty key. And then also obviously people that you work with. And then I think evaluating yourself too is important as well. And
let's dig into the evaluating yourself, because you mentioned that, and I think that could be a first step actually for someone coming out and listening to this podcast is let me evaluate if I'm leading myself well, whether it's in the growth area or it's in the moment, like knowing myself and how I respond. Mm-hmm. How do you do, like, what can you do? What have you done to help figure out if you're leading yourself well or if there's some areas you need to improve?
Yeah. I mean, so some people all right, so the most basic one that people probably spend the most time talking about is just, analyzing their time. Because if you know your priorities and then you look at your time, like you're going to know, all right, what are some things that maybe I need to cut? And like basically every leadership book ever written will say, hey, manage your time, like track your time. How are you spending it? Does it line up with your priorities? If it doesn't, that's probably why you're feeling some stress because you haven't created that margin. You have identified those time wasters. So that's a big one. But those two things. But then also I think understanding your strengths and what your challenge spots are. And so there's lots of personality tests that help you do that. And so the one that I have used the most for myself is the path elements profile. It puts you in wind, fire, earth, and water. I am very wind. So that for me, when I saw that several years ago on paper, and that was through Brother Jim's Infused Network, like that's like, oh, okay, this is a really good indicator of myself. Like this is absolutely me on paper. And going back to that periodically, like every 3 months, and being like, okay, these are where I'm still strong, and these are the areas that are still a challenge for me, or these are the areas that, man, they've kind of shifted a little bit. So for me, one of my things is like, for example, being reactionary, as I talked about earlier, like that's in my challenge part of my profile. So I know that I need to be more responsive instead of reactionary. And then, using that tool to be like, all right, what are some identifiable steps that I can take? So evaluating your strengths and weaknesses and whether or not they're being effective as you want them to be. And really, it's just about taking the time to do that. A lot of us say, oh, we're so busy, I don't have time to do that. Well, then that takes you back to evaluating your time. But we know that if we spend that time doing it, like that's an investment that you're making in yourself that's going to make you so much more effective later. And so just saving it, putting that time right now is going to exponentially increase your ability to take care of stuff and other people as you move forward. So I think that's really good. And we know that, God's going to give us what we need when we need it. And so we just need to believe that as it relates to leading ourselves as well, that we're going to have what we need, those tools, and use them. That's really the trick, I think. I think we all know what we need to be better at, but it's just actually taking the time to do it.
Yeah, that's true. Because there's always pressure to, get something else done that has to be done for this Sunday or whatever. And typically leading oneself or getting better or growing is not urgent. It's not like it has to happen by tomorrow. Yeah.
And the urgent, we know, is the enemy of doing what really is needed to be done. And so we really need to fight against that urgency, or at least put urgency in its own little corner and manage it well and say, all right, these few hours of the week are dedicated to urgency, and the rest I need to just develop on myself. So,
yep. That's good.
Yeah.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about your transition going from leading children's ministry to leading the NextGen team, and the alignment there and how you've worked on that. And so we're going to dig into that. For anyone who's listening that is the same in the same role, obviously, they're going to relate it right to their role. But for someone who leads student ministry or children's ministry, I think the principles are really the same, because most leaders are leading multiple areas, whether that's nursery and toddlers and then preschool age, or it's, they lead all of children's ministry. So they got preschool plus elementary, or it's a student ministry and you've got small groups and you got large group and you got events and you got trips. Yeah. And so I think the principles are helpful no matter where you lead, just because very few of us lead in like one specific lane where, it's all similar and it's pretty easy to be one team and one focus. So I think that'll be helpful for anyone. But as we jump into it, tell us a little bit about your transition to this role. How long ago was it? What does it look like practically? Like, how does your team structured, all that stuff?
Okay, so we'll have to go back to the very beginning. A little flashback sequence, right? So, like growing up, like honestly felt like I was called to student ministry. Like I think a lot of people going through that, maybe not, maybe it's just me, but I feel like a lot of people, I was going to do student ministry. And then I got into it in college, like studying it. And I realized, man, they keep telling me it's all experience based. So what am I doing in a classroom? And I kind of shifted out of that and aligned myself with children's ministry because there was a need there. And some of my giftings were well suited for that as far as theatricality and music and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I landed. And so children's ministry was really like my thing. And then after a couple of years, I started understanding like it couldn't be isolated, like it needed to all be together. And so our student pastor at the time, he and I kind of were on each other's support. So we didn't like play well together. We didn't play not well together, but we were just kind of doing our own thing. There wasn't a lot of crossover. And he ended up leaving the States to go to Uganda. It's a really cool story. His family was adopting a girl, and the only way they could continue to adopt her through this process was to move to Uganda and be physically with her for like three years. And they're still there today. And so it was in that transition where the conversation first came up at my church, like, hey, what if we, and I was the one initiating it, what if we like put them all under the same umbrella and we just kind of aligned all of those teams together? And at first, like that was not the direction that my senior leadership wanted to go. And so I still kind of inherited students and kids ministry for about 10 months while they were searching for a student pastor. So I was doing all of those things. So while it was there, like I was still kind of doing some things that would make it a little aligned. We hired a student pastor who just didn't work out in our culture here. And about 6 months after his hire, there was a mutual parting of ways there. And my senior pastor came to me and said, hey, we're going to do the NextGen thing. You just take it all over and we'll hire some student pastors to be under you and we'll figure it out. And so that's kind of how we came to kind of put all of those teams under the same umbrella. And that was just about 2.5 years ago. And so that was a very quick conversation from he and I. And then it was kind of left, all right, what does that look like? So like, what do we do with that? And so in one hand, I was like, all right, I really hope that someone tells me what that looks like. And then the other hand, I'm like, no, being a self-leader, I'll go figure it out. And so that's what we did. So the way we're structured is I'm kind of wearing a hat and a half. Like I'm the NextGen leader, pastor, and I have my niche is still children's ministry. I have a high school student pastor and I have a middle school student pastor. I have 2 part-timers that help me with children, which is a preschool director and a elementary director. And then I also have like a part-time ministry assistant. And so actually that role is being filled by my elementary director. So she's full-time. So there's 5 of us total on our team right now. And that's the way it's been for a few years, which has been really great.
Now, I know this, the answer here may be just that you tried it the other way and it didn't work. But I know a lot of leaders who are in this model or want to be in this model. They have to explain, they have to fight for why they think this is the way to go. You know what I mean? Because their leader's response is the same as yours.
Right.
I don't know if we want to do that. And maybe the answer for you is just, hey, they tried it their way and just so happened that guy didn't work out. But was there anything in the conversation that really helped convince them? Because I know some people who are listening, they want to know what that is because they're trying to convince somebody.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. And it's not something I don't usually talk a whole lot about, but I will. So I'll be honest. And, that conversation when I set that up. So before we started the process of me being over everything for 10 months, kind of running solo. And in the front end of that, to have that conversation where I said, all right, here's the benefits of us aligning everything. And I kind of laid it all out there, right? Like I had my bullet point presentation, like I was like ready to answer any and every question. And so that was like a good, like, hey, here's a snapshot of what it could be. This is how easy it would be for us to do that. All right. So I was feeling like everybody's going to go for this. Like, why wouldn't anyone go for this? And then to be told no, like that was a big blow, right? Like, and anybody else who's been in that conversation or is about to have that conversation, I probably didn't set myself up well for a no.
You thought it was going to be,
I thought this was
going to be
easy.
amazing.
Oh, this is a cake. Yeah. And so for someone like me, who's just like, man, I know what's going to be better. Like, why wouldn't we do this? Like, that was a really big deal for me and really hard. And fortunately I had people around me, that kind of walked me through that. And, I was patient. And so that 10 months where I was doing students and kids ministry, that was a really hard 10 months. It really was. But I think that was laying the ground for what was so I couldn't see what was ahead, right? So when they hired someone to take over student ministry and they saw that, they knew I had already proven myself that I could do well at doing both. And how much more could we do if we actually had people dedicated to it? So I kind of looked at it as a training ground for myself to insert me into student ministry. So you have to put that in their perspective. They have a kids guy saying, put me over students. That is a hard sell because you haven't been in student ministry. You haven't really participated in it. All right. So maybe you showed up a few times, but what have you actually done? What have you invested in there? And the inside of you wants to say, I invested in those kids before they were students. Like I have all this history with them, but they don't see that. They don't know that. And so you really kind of just have to listen and understand why they're going the direction they're going, but then also serve in that area. And so that's what I ended up doing for 10 months, just being there. I think that really came back to their minds after things didn't work out with our student pastor that was hired. And so their first instinct after that was, let's go to Aaron and let's see what he can do, because he's already done it. And so I know that's a hard conversation to have, but I think it's worth it. And then I would also say, just be patient with the results of that and just be faithful in that as well, because you don't know what's coming down the road. And if you're in that position and the answer is no, then you can still do a lot of things without having that structure. Like, you don't have to have a NextGen structure where there's a NextGen pastor and, all that kind of stuff. You can get in the same room with other ministry leaders without that structure. You can get in the same room and have conversations about, all right, how are we doing with kids and students? Like, how are you winning? How can I win better to set you up better for success? Like, you can have conversations without a structural or organizational overhaul. And I think that's important for people to remember. You're still on the same team. It just might not be called NextGen team. It just might be structured that way, but you can still work together and you can still play together if everyone sees the benefit.
Yeah, and even though, so in your example, there was a void there because there was no staff person in place, and so you got to use that as a chance to build trust and show them what it could look like. For somebody who's in a church where they actually have someone in the role, they can do what you just said. They can work together, work on some things together, and you can initiate that and use that as an example of like, hey, this is what it could look like. That's good. The thing I always think about it is, in some church size matters a lot here. It's hard to do that at certain sizes, but at the end of the day, somebody's leading both the children's person and the student person. And why not have it be someone who's thinking about the whole thing in mind, as opposed to so many different ministries that are so different, because a lot of times that's the other model, is it's an executive pastor or something like that, where, their scope is much wider. And you can't do it. Depends on your church size. Not all budgets and church sizes can support that model, but that's one of the things I come back to is like, why not? Why not do that as opposed to kind of the older model where they're separate and independent? They are, because they should work together. It should seem seamless from 5th grade to 6th or whatever. It
really should. And that's where I don't think sometimes they know enough about each other to see that. So one thing that our team does is we really do try to spend time with each other, not just in the room together when we're hanging out, but really spending time with each other during ministry times. So like my student team, like, they know Sunday morning they're supposed to be out hanging with students as much as possible because our student ministry meets on Sunday nights. So Sunday morning is kind of like a connect point for them, just to be visible with students. But they also know that students serve in kids ministry. And because of that, like, they're on our hall on kids, Sunday morning, and they're encouraging those students who are serving. And they also know that they're on call as backup in case, I have leaders out, like they're going to jump in and be ready to go. And they have. And so that's just a cool thing because they understand the benefit of all of that. So I've also asked them to come in sometimes and just be like, hey, I need you to evaluate what we're doing. Just look at this, from your perspective. What do you see that maybe needs to be better? Like what are some things that we could change? And I think asking those questions is good. And then for me, like spending time in their space, even though I'm NextGen and I should anyway, but from a kid's perspective, coming in and saying, all right, what are some things like how is my fifth grade setting them up for middle school when they get in there? Where's the transition that we could overlap, and just evaluating, helping each other. And that does require a certain degree of humility and openness and communication and trusting each other. But sometimes you just need those other set of eyes that you trust to tell you something that needs to be said or thought about. So
that's a good action step right now, that anybody who has this similar structure, even if you don't have a NextGen structure, can you invite leaders in other areas of family ministry or whatever to come in and evaluate? That's really good. It's like the secret shopper thing, except,
right.
It's not that much of a secret, but it is another set of eyes, which is great.
If you trust that person, like if you're on the same team and, that they have your back and you have theirs, then they can tell you anything and be honest, and you can take it and apply it, or you can explain, later and be like, well, after evaluating, hearing what you're saying, but I think, this does work best. But you can't shut it down. Like, so I think sometimes when we hear criticism, even from people that we trust, our first reaction is to defend what we're doing without really listening and to see the other perspective, right? To really understand what they're saying and how we can apply it. And we should definitely be doing that, at least with the people on our team, because we're trying to get to the same goal. And from a NextGen pastor kind of role, if they give me some feedback and it really is rooted in a deep why, in children's ministry, or specifically, that gives me an opportunity to kind of educate more in the philosophy of why we do things this way in kids ministry, but why maybe that wouldn't work in student ministry and vice versa. So everything nothing's discarded. It's either an education point or it really is an evaluation point when we invite other people into our space.
What are some other things that have helped your team transition to go from not necessarily silos, but not on one team to now one team, you're all together? What are some things practically, because that question comes up all the time for people in this role, is how do we actually become one team? What does the transition look like from where we are? And sometimes I think they even want to know what is the end goal? Like, what does the picture of success look like? At the end, and you're 2.5 years in. So I think most of us that are 2.5 years in aren't sure either. But what's worked along the way to help you make the transition?
So one thing is looking at, and I mean like drawing this out, is finding those places where you're already overlapping, I think is really key. So like we know there's transition points, right, where we're going to overlap. We know that, preschoolers moving into kindergarten is an overlap. There's transitions like that, fifth to middle school or whatever that overlap is for you, middle school to high school to college, whatever your overlaps are, there are those specific transitions. But beyond that, sharing resources can be an overlap. So when my student guys have this crazy idea for some strange game and they need certain supplies, they're like, oh, well, I already have that. Or have you thought about doing this? So just sharing resources, sharing those overlaps, those transitions. When you just look at it on paper, you're going to find out that you're already more aligned than you thought. When you look at volunteers and how you train them, you're going to find out that you're already overlapped more than you think because you care about the same things, right? We're leading leaders to lead kids and students. So there's some things that we can kind of streamline and make better. So let's find those spots where we're already overlapping and then work to kind of just make that better. And then also, I think, connecting those dots for some people. And I tend to think that kids, people, and maybe this is completely biased. You have to tell me, Nick, if I am, but I am. I know it's biased, right? So like, I think kids people have this tendency to be able to look at student ministry more easily than students people can look at kids ministry. And I think that's because when we're working with kids, like we are seeing their future, right? Like we know the investment that we're making has a payoff, but we won't see it until they are students. So we're already looking ahead. But student guys don't always understand or realize that there's been a lot built into them to get them to that point. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like for them to look backward is difficult because as leaders anyway, we're vision people, right? Like we want to always look forward. So kids people are looking forward all the way. Student people are looking forward from their point forward. So to kind of connect those dots for them and say, all right, let's see what's been played into this that has brought them to this point, I think is going to be more important as we move forward. Now, again, I'm biased because my niche is kids. And so maybe I'm speaking out of turn a little bit.
I don't know. I agree. I'm thinking about it. I'm like, I agree. And I think why I agree. I think some of it might be there are similarities between, and again, if somebody's listening and serves in one world or the other, might disagree. But having been in all these worlds in so many different ways myself, there are similarities between student ministry and kids ministry, particularly if you're talking older elementary.
Yeah.
That are pretty similar in a lot of ways. And you could even, certain churches would make them even more similar. Now, the younger you get with kids, the more diverse it gets. And so that's where I could see where it'd be easier for like a kids person to just take what's they've seen in like elementary, older elementary, and relate it to student ministry, and just conceptually it all makes sense. Versus I could understand if I'd only done student ministry. I did this. I mean, I'd only volunteered in student ministry and even led it in the absence of a pastor at a church I grew up in for a while. And then when we started our church, I was like you, I was the kids pastor. So I mean, I experienced what it was like to have to learn more than the stuff that I already had in place from student ministry. Because when you start talking about, you know, the nursery and preschool kids and just the difference that it takes, you know, in student ministry, there are huge differences in age groups, but the strategy doesn't change all that much from 7th grade to say 11th grade. The strategy and whatever it looks like in a room, you know, for a 1-year-old to a 3-year-old is like so different. So that might be the other piece too, is for children's ministry, it is so different birth through 5th grade. Student ministry, there's a lot of similarities. It looks a little bit different, but for the most part, I see churches using the same strategy, right? Have some kind of large group experience, get them in some kind of small group, get them serving, be in their life outside of church. Like that's essentially what it looks like. That might be why. I was thinking to myself, I totally agree, but I'm not sure why.
Well, that's important to figure out, right? Because so a student person who is in a NextGen role or moves into that role, like they'll have a completely different perspective. So it'd be interesting to hear what they think about it. Like, do they find themselves looking back? And so one thing that I love is that my high school student pastor, like he's very big on getting students to serve in kids ministry. So for him, that's the connecting point. Like that's the dot that's going to get them connected, is because if we know that if we can get students to serve in kids ministry or anywhere really, that they'll be more connected to their faith, more connected to the church. And so whatever that looks like, you just have to connect those dots for everyone. And so that means preschool to high school. And obviously you have to get in the same room to do that, and also share space. Like we talked earlier, like show up at other people's events, show up on their regular stuff just to be a part of it and show that you're unified, I think is a big deal.
Does your kids team, because like you mentioned that your student team can be like backups for children's ministry, and it makes sense because I mean your church is probably like ours where they have to be there anyway for services, and like you said, there isn't programming. Does your kids team show up and do things for student ministry? Because that one's a little tougher because they don't typically have to be there.
Right, they don't have to. Yeah, so right, but I think it's important to do that. So my elementary director definitely does. She serves in, like on Sunday mornings. She's obviously over elementary programming, but then also she comes back every week for students on Sunday nights because she developed relationships with those kids when they were 5th graders, right? And so now she's coming back, and she doesn't have like a sacred spot on Sunday nights with students. Like she's not a small group leader. She doesn't have to be. She doesn't have a designated role. She really just comes because she loves those students, and she's there as extra support. And so she does that already on her own. When there's events and we need extra hands or whatever, we're going to ask everyone to jump in with each other to make sure that things go smoothly and things go well. And again, that comes back to just, you know, how does your team work together? Do you have each other's back, and not just in in words, but in action. I'm not saying that you have to be at each other's events all the time, but I think finding those moments that are critical and knowing that they need that extra support can be really helpful. And it shows your families of your church that, man, this is a group of adults. This is a team that is all there for my kid at any phase of life. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I've seen, and we've done this a little bit, we could definitely do a lot better job too, where the kids team can really help with like special events for students, whether it's a trip or a retreat, and they're just helping do the check-in, before they leave or whatever it might be. There's kind of the roles that are hard to fill in student ministry because you have people doing everything else that you need to do. The kids team, even kids volunteers can come and help fill in some of those gaps, no different than student. Like I know our student volunteers, our student staff, we do lean on them, like when it's Christmas Eve services and there's way more, and Easter and there's more services than normal. And it's like, hey, student ministry isn't meeting this weekend on purpose, but we need your help here. And it is great. Right. It's a big team builder for them to get involved, which is huge.
Well, it also makes it easy for students to get plugged in as well. So if our goal is to get students involved and connected in ministry, like this happened this past Sunday, we were out a few leaders in one of our gatherings. And so, my elementary director, her name's Jacqueline, she said, go grab Stephen and Caleb and have them grab some students with them. And so they come back and they're like grabbing students who are going to assist them for the morning, and they're like plugging in. And so those students who maybe would have never come back, never would have served otherwise, they get a taste of what it could be like every single week. And so that's a great entry point as well to get new students. And we've had students who are like, oh, this is great. Like, I love this. This is fun. And so they'll stick around with it.
That's awesome. What else? Yeah. Is there anything else that you've done that has been helpful in, unifying the team, becoming one team?
Well, so I already mentioned a little bit about valuing each other. I think that goes really well with like publicly as well, not just in your own teams. Obviously, you want to share wins and share stories with each other. I think that's really important. Like, I think high school needs to know what preschool is up to. And here's a great example of this. Like, we have a high school student who serves with our toddlers. All right. This high school student, I mean, he's a big guy. He's like football player size kind of guy. And he serves in a toddler room. And there is one kid, who's 1 year old, and he loves Mr. Daniel. He talks when they drive past the building and he goes, oh, Daniel, like he's talking about that high school leader. So I think connecting and valuing each other, that's a story that I want shared, not just with my team, as kids team, but I want that shared with all of our students so that they know the impact that they could be having. Like, that's important. I think speaking the same language is a big one as well. So developing a language, I think language really drives culture. So I was an English major in college. And so I like how we use words, how we use phrases, I think matters a lot. I think how we say things matters. And so if we can find phrases or key words or whatever it might be that's going to be a seamless language that's created all the way from preschool to high school, I think that's going to be really important because it shows that unity. Language shows unity. That's why your church's mission statement is one statement. You don't have a different mission statement for everybody in the church, right? Like, every team is going to be like, all right, our mission statement is this. We're going to support that. And so we have that. The execution of that, once we get to strategy, that's where we want the language to really be the same and how we're going to do that.
Did you have to change any? Did you have to you were going from different teams to one team? Was there anything like we changed what we called that or, that you can think of?
Yeah. So we're not big on like names, like naming events. Like, so I know some churches will be like, everything's NextGen, and then it just gets confusing because it's like NextGen kids, NextGen student, whatever. So to the average person, we're probably still separated, but where it kind of came together is just in the phrases that we use. And I think, all right, so those of us that use an orange strategy, that's really great because a lot of that is kind of, I don't want to say given to you, but it really is. They phrase things so well that you don't have to spend time rephrasing it, So the example, the phrase, when you see how much time you have left, you'll do more with the time you have now. So that's a phrase that we've integrated into our volunteers, like to know, hey, you only have a few weeks left with your group of kids. Like, what are you doing with that? So different phrases like that we've just kind of introduced. I don't know that we had to change anything. And that's probably because, this is going to sound really bad, but everyone here will tell you our student ministry has been, about 5 years behind the rest of the church up until the last couple of years. So there wasn't a lot to change because there wasn't a lot in place.
Yeah. So you created it, with this one language in mind. Ours was similar. Like we've always, we were officially unified, I guess you could say, with staff and structure probably like 6 years ago. But it wasn't like it was that big of a change because small groups were small groups with kids. That's what we called it with students. Versus that's an area where sometimes you could see it be different. It's like their life groups here, or their whatever,
right.
here. And simple phrases like that can be different and can be confusing. We didn't have to do that. We did get a little more unified in language with changing of the brand, where we our church is Community Christian Church, and we don't use the 3C thing a lot, but we will there, or C3, I'm sorry. So we'll say C3 kids and C3 students. And they used to be more branded by environment, like the age group, with the different names, and it had like a water theme for kids.
Yeah.
And, student ministry didn't have a theme so much, but distinct names. So that's been helpful. But I think we were just like you, where it was like, you know what? We don't have to change a whole lot. We just have to be a little bit more intentional about the language we're using and saying it the same way in both areas. But some folks, I think, do need to be intentional and really make a change. And I don't know if it needs to be like you're saying, NextGen kids. I don't even know if NextGen needs to be part of it. But like if you're calling groups one thing here and something different there, if volunteer titles are totally different all over the place, maybe those get, unified or whatever.
And that's where I think, like, with going back to earlier when we were talking about, like, see where you're already overlapping, like, those are the simple things that you could just rename. Like, so if you were to go back to that list and see, all right, what are the things that are already overlapping as far as transitions or volunteers or how we're structured or any of those kinds of things? Okay, great. Then what are we just let's rename those so that they're all the same, so it's not confusing. And ours, for example, like kids was kind of already structured before most of the other areas in the church, as far as we had leaders, we had a coach, we had a director. And that was kind of how we were structured on a volunteer level. And that actually spilled over then into students. Once that came under a NextGen umbrella, we just invited that same structure there. And then it happened that the whole church just kind of like, oh, that's a great structure if we want to replenish volunteers and build leadership and that kind of stuff. And so that language, some of it has spilled into the rest of the church as well. And at the same time, we have to, be mindful of the vision of the house, right? Of the church as a whole. Like what aspects of that language needs to be inserted into our kids and student culture right now. And so we're still evaluating that and trying to figure that out as well. We actually had a meeting last week and we're following up tomorrow to kind of narrow down some of those phrases that maybe need to be present everywhere.
That's awesome. Well, this has been really helpful. Kind of hit two big topics here that are close to you, and I think close to most leaders, and whether they're NextGen pastors or not. Most people are leading multiple teams, and we all need to. It is true that you got to lead yourself first and best, so that's been really helpful too. If people have questions or anything like that, or they want to connect with you, how can they do that?
So you can just reach out. Like we said at the beginning, my Twitter handle is Aaron Jack Bauer. And also my Instagram and also my Facebook. And so it's just really unified. Aaron Jack Bauer. And it's Bauer is my last name, just like the show.
Just like the character.
So that's probably the easiest way. Yeah. And then if you want to tag in at iCloud.com to the end of it, that's my email. So
cool.
Try to keep it simple.
Yeah, that is simple. So, way to go. Good for you getting all those those handles and things.
Yeah, I had to get it before somebody else took it, right?
Yeah, especially with a popular name in there. Cool. Right. All right. Well, Aaron, I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us, and this has been really helpful for everyone. Thanks.
No, thanks, Nick. It was a lot of fun.
Aaron is a great leader and an example of how you must lead yourself if you want to lead at a higher level. Just like he has gone from leading children's ministry to now leading the whole NextGen team. Aaron's also another example of why it's good to get coaching or a mentor or something like that. Aaron has been through Jim Weidman's Infuse program, and I'm sure we didn't even talk about that, but I'm sure he would say how important that has been for him. And now he's helping pour into other leaders through that as well. And so, if you're interested in getting coaching and you're a children's ministry leader, I highly recommend going to jimweidman.com and jumping in the next Infuse group. I know one just started, but there'll be another one right around the corner. And that's really, really helpful as well. In the interview, we talked about a couple action items that I think would be great to take. One is to evaluate how well you were leading yourself. We always evaluate how others are doing, or maybe even how well we're doing at leading others, but how well are you doing at leading yourself. Evaluate that, see what changes you can make. And the other thing is to invite leaders from other areas of family ministry into your environment, like we talked about, to give some feedback, maybe give you some things that you haven't thought about before, notice some things that you've just missed. That's always helpful. Even getting somebody maybe from outside the church could be helpful as well. Everything we talked about, all the links, show notes, all that stuff can be found at nickblevins.com/episode 46. In the next episode of the podcast, I talk with Justin Knowles, student pastor, and Justin and I talk about student ministry programming and what that looks like at his church and how do you get creativity in student ministry programming. We also talk a little bit about volunteer culture. So you don't want to miss that, even if you lead in children's ministry. There's similarities there with culture and programming and creativity and all that. So be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.